I'd like to introduce you today to Hasan Waheed, who's going to be leading one of our adolescent certificate modules on the 28th of April, so not that far off, specifically on ethnicity, identity, and racism. I really wanted to start off before we got into the course itself, Hasan, to just find out a little bit about you. So you're a clinical psychologist and you're also working in an organization called Just Psychology in Manchester. I wonder if you could just kick off by saying a little bit about the organization and what led you to join it, because to be honest with you, in my experience, it's quite different from the majority of sort of psychology and therapy services.
Yeah, of course. That's a great question, Paul. So Just Psychology is a social enterprise that offers support to children and families in a way that is accessible and culturally appropriate to their needs. So I've been in and out of the organisation since starting my career as an assistant psychologist. I then went back at the beginning of last year as a trainee clinical psychologist as a part of my doctorate training. And now I'm back again as a qualified clinical psychologist. And part of my role at the moment is around supervision and consultation to one of our newer projects in terms, it's called the Family Reunion and Parenting Project. So we're providing support to families who have recently migrated to the UK in 3 different ways. So one of those is by offering parenting sessions to raise awareness of what parenting looks like in the UK, because we recognise that parenting can look very, very different across cultures. The other work stream is offering family reunion groups, which is based on a narrative therapy called Tree of Life. And the aim of those groups are really to support families who have experienced family separation following their migration. And then the third bit is just like a peer mentoring scheme to help people transition out of the project. Because what we often find in mainstream services is that people kind of come in, get a bit of therapy, and then they're left to their own devices without any additional social support. So we ensure that they're paired up with one of our cultural consultants. So that's a little bit about the organisation and how I'm involved at the minute. But I guess the reason why I've stayed so close to the organisation, and in particular the director, Dr. Fatima Lane, is because of our shared value of work, of wanting to work in a culturally competent way. And often this means thinking about things in a slightly different way and using different frameworks to inform our clinical practice.
Okay, well, that sort of provides an important link in, I guess, to really where I wanted to sort of go next with this, which is why, in your opinion, do you think as therapists, why would you say it is so important for us to develop cultural competence around ethnicity and identity, for example?
It's a really good question, Paul. I think for me, I often get asked this question a lot, and I think it can be broadly covered in 3 points. And, speaking from personal experience, the first rationale for developing cultural competence is because we live in a multicultural society, and we need to recognise that people do migrate into the country. And, there are certain families who are born into systems which consist of multiple cultures. And we're actually seeing an increase in that across the UK. We just have to look at, the census data and the increase in ethnicity rates over the years. But with that, we need to recognise that there are differences in the way that people view the world, seek and use knowledge, but also conceptualise and express mental health difficulties. And with that, I think there also needs to be this understanding that the systems that we are placed in and also the mainstream society itself can shape cognition and have an impact on an individual's view of their self, but also how they relate with other people. And I think there's a real risk of invalidating and being dismissive of someone's identity, which will then, of course, have an impact on the therapeutic relationship and the outcomes of the intervention. So that would be my primary reason. But then we just need to kind of go back to, you know, the evidence base and look at the statistics. We know that mental health difficulties is a real concern across diverse ethnic communities, and there's a whole host of reasons as to why that might be the case, and we can touch on some of that, you know, in the upcoming training. But we just need to kind of go back to the fundamentals. We just look at the legislation, and certainly here in the UK, we have the Equality Act, which sets a precedent for us to ensure that service users from different backgrounds are not discriminated directly or indirectly based on their protected characteristics like ethnicity. So there are a lot of reasons, but I think for me, those are the key ones that I often draw on when I'm answering questions with regards to the importance of cultural competence.
So if I've caught this correctly, there's three broad aspects to this which will be important to anyone who's working as a therapist, who is working with someone who has a, how would you describe this, a different cultural background? Would that be the most helpful way to describe it?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, a different cultural background. So there's first of all some, for want of a better term, quite a broad range of beliefs that may be part of the culture that that person's a part of. There's issues around beliefs relating particularly to mental health and mental illness. And there's also issues that are around the interface or the position of the person with a different cultural background and being within a culture that basically is different. Is that, have I got that right? Or is
yeah, I think you said that in a very succinct way, Paul. Yeah, that's absolutely the points that I was trying to address.
Okay, so I guess I can see from my perspective how, if I don't actually have sort of that sort of awareness or knowledge regarding the individual I've got in front of me, it's going to be easy to, well, you mentioned first of all invalidating people, but there's also presumably an issue here where you can both miss the mark and not properly engage the person as well. Is that a fair point to make?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely fair point to make. I think, you know, we have to recognize that we have our own upbringing and our own life experiences, and especially, in our education systems, it's not something that is really spoken about in therapy in great detail. So we already have that blind spot in our therapeutic work. And I guess part of this thinking, but also the training that I'm going to be delivering, is getting people to kind of step out of their comfort zones and think about things in a slightly different way, and just name some of that, some of that stuff that perhaps they're struggling with in sessions or just don't quite get.
Right. Okay. I mean, can you just put a bit of flesh on the bones here? Can you give us an example where increased cultural competence or knowledge has actually led to, well, basically a better outcome for a client, or where the therapist has ended up with a different perspective on the client's problems as a result of that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I could go through a huge list of adaptations that therapists could make from an individual perspective, but also an organizational perspective. But I think the classic example is just around that concept of engagement. And as a specialist interest of mine, I often look for those cases that involve working with children and families from diverse ethnic backgrounds. And then when you start to read through the historical note-taking, what I often find is that this narrative starts to emerge where the young person, and maybe in some cases the family as well, are not attending sessions or engaging with the therapeutic models that are being delivered. And I think that can be quite unhelpful. So my initial approach used to be to take on these cases on an individual basis and try to work in a slightly different way. But what I realized over the years is that one of my roles as a clinical psychologist is to actually upskill other professionals and model what best practice looks like when working with difference. So I do a lot more joint working with mental health practitioners now. And I think it's in those moments when I'm doing joint working and I'm asking questions about someone's culture or someone's migration journey, or even things like spirituality and faith. I think that's when practitioners start to realize the importance of asking those type of questions in terms of not just opening up the conversation, but also understanding the relevance that it has to that person's current presentation. So I think it's just, that curiosity really, and bravery just to ask some of those questions, because sometimes I feel like there is that fear of getting things wrong. But from my personal experience, just asking those questions actually strengthens that therapeutic relationship.
Right. Okay. So it's got some very big potential implications at even the basic level of engaging clients. I mean, obviously, this particular training module that you're delivering on ethnicity, identity, and racism is part of the BPS approved certificate in integrated CBT for adolescents. Can you just say a little as to why you think these issues are particularly important when working with adolescents?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the stuff that, I've already kind of mentioned before, but what I would say is that when we are working with children and adolescents, it's an absolutely crucial period of their life where they're not only learning about the world, but they're also learning about themselves in terms of their own internal working model. And it can often be a confusing time for adolescents to navigate the nuances of culture, ethnicity, and race during those stages of identity formation. And I think what often happens is that these conversations are not spoken about. So young people and adolescents go through their life without learning how to deal with these issues related to racism, or have conversations around cultural issues like migration or acculturation. So I think that's the key bit. Children are still developing at this stage, and we've got a really good opportunity to intervene early and prevent those moments of crisis that we often see in mainstream services.
Right. Okay. Okay. That's sort of that I guess leads me into all sorts of further thoughts and questions. But I do appreciate that we need to wait until the 28th of April to begin to address those in a lot more detail. Can I just say I'm really looking forward to the event that you're going to be running on the 28th, and look forward to seeing you again there in just over nearly a couple of months' time. So take care and look after yourself.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. Take care.